everyone. My name is Wendy Potter and I'm a program manager here in the Victim Services and Crime Prevention Division. I wanted to welcome you and thank you for attending this webinar today on risk assessment and safety planning. I also want to take this time to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We are honored and grateful to be living and working here. This 2-hour planning is being presented by Laura Woods, who is a program manager with the Ending Violence Association of BC, and Debbie Hamilton, who is EVA BC's Community Coordination for Women's Safety Program ICAT consultant. Thanks to both of them for presenting today. Before we get started, please ensure that you have muted your computer and phone. Also, if you have any technical difficulties with the online meeting and are unable to rejoin the online meeting for whatever reason, please follow along on the conference call line with the PowerPoint. The conference call line is 1-877-353-9184, and the participant ID is 4477604#. These were also sent out in the email that was sent to you. There will be an opportunity to ask questions following the presentation. I am looking forward to this webinar as well as hearing from many of you today. Now we will get started.
Hi everyone, it's Debbie Hamilton here. I'm so happy that so many of you can join, and Laura and I are really grateful to be able to spread the word and talk about what we love working with. So I'll begin, and there's quite a large deck of slides, but I think both Laura and I won't be speaking word to every slide. We're going to add in our own information and have the slides available to you as well. And so I'll carry on. If you can't hear, I do see a few messages coming up for people saying they can't hear. So please, if you can send that message, and then we can try to do some adjustments as we go along. We have the luxury of having technical support here, so unlike our usual trainings and communities, so happy to have that. So the topic today is risk identification and safety planning. And we're going to talk a little bit differently than we might in ICAT training or in training that talks about safety planning. We're going to overlap a little bit, and it's geared towards anti-violence workers, but from our experience, we know it might be really interesting to others. So just to get started, domestic violence is also referred to as intimate partner violence, spousal assault, family violence, and some other terms as well, in historically battering, wife assault. And it accounts for about 1 in 5 murders. So it's a really serious community problem that I think all of us are aware of now, but I can say in the past, probably it hasn't had the community awareness that it does now about what a serious problem it is. So we've come to the point where we have evidence-based predictable risk factors to assist us in making domestic homicide and serious bodily harm predictable and hopefully preventable. Oops, I'm trying to move 2 computers at once here. So, and I think what makes it so tricky and what in the past has made it go under the radar is there's some really important features, really complex factors, and sometimes frustrating for those who don't understand the dynamics of domestic violence and why women don't leave immediately. And people don't generally understand, the general public doesn't understand why it's so illogical. And when we understand, that helps make it more, then we can do something about it. So Laura and I are going to talk briefly about that. And so the next slide that we're going on to is talking about the terms risk assessment. We do use risk assessment and risk identification, lethality assessment interchangeably, but really what we do in our agencies and in our collaborative teams isn't really risk assessment. Risk assessment generally refers to a team of trained professionals who have extensive training in risk assessment. But what we do is identify risk. And just a word about gender before we go on. Laura and I will probably both use the term violence against women. And we know that many of our partners who we collaborate with use a more gender neutral term. It's in their agency policy. Or they may refer to it as intimate partner violence, family violence, spousal assault. But I have to say, even though we use women in the terms of being a victim and males in the term of being a perpetrator, we're really aware that that women use violence toward men. It's different, but they do use violence towards men, same-sex relationships. And we also know that the perpetrator, whether he's a male or she's a female, deserves some attention as well, not just so that they can have a better quality of life, but so that we can support him to keep the victim safer.
And we're also very aware, it's Laura Woods, that some people don't identify as either male or female, and that we need to be more aware of being gender fluid.
Thanks, Laura. So the next slide is a quote from the coroner's death review panel, which we'll talk about very briefly, but a little bit further on. And part of the problem in identifying and responding to domestic violence is that no one agency or person has all of the information. It's many different people hold pieces of it, and that's been revealed in many coroners' reports and inquests, and also in the recent or relatively recent death review. If you'd like, and just to reiterate, this short webinar is not in depth enough to teach us how to be risk assessors, but it will provide an awareness so that people who are on the call and in your agencies, you can get more of an awareness if you don't have a lot already, and more awareness if you do, so that you can understand what risk factors we need to be looking at, and we can also support the people we work with to identify those risks as well. EVA BC has more resources on that, as do many of our partner agencies, so we can help you get that if you need it. Collaborative risk, the next slide speaks to risk identification, and collaborative risk identification incorporates additional information from services in the community to reveal a more complete picture of risk and protective factors, including third parties that may be at risk. So we see it as a community problem, as well as a problem that is the primary victim may experience more profoundly. And the process that you go through, whether it's in your agency or with your collaborative team, will serve as a foundation of a referral that you will send to your local ICAP through the police in your community or high-risk domestic violence team, and can alert you and your colleagues in your agency to the fact that you're providing service to someone who may be at higher risk. And the slide talks about the purpose of facilitating the efforts. Really, the whole purpose isn't necessarily to mark somebody as high risk, but it's to raise the awareness that there's issues surrounding that person that a safety plan and risk management can help mitigate. So, good risk identification tools take into consideration the nature of domestic violence and also the perpetrator risk factors and survivor vulnerability. For many years, we looked at most anti-violence agencies became very well aware and did very good safety planning around the victim and her children and perhaps extended family. But now we know the risk identification tools take into consideration, in fact, most of the risk factors are about the perpetrator, and the woman knows more about him than anyone else, and she can provide that information. So it's really to create the full picture, perpetrator risk factors, and to assess the likelihood of future violence. There's a number of recognized domestic violence risk tools, including the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment, the ODERA, the Spousal Assault Assessment, which Community Corrections uses, and the Be Safer, which I think Community Corrections is aware of and police are using quite frequently. what in BC, what seems to be, it's becoming universal almost across the responders and supporters of people who are involved in domestic violence, is the summary of domestic violence risk factors, or the 19 risk factors as we call them. They're compatible with Be Safer, but there's also more factors in the 19 risk factors that address other parts of violence. It was a collaborative tool that was developed for frontline responders, police, child protection workers, and I should say the child protection workers have a 20th risk factor that is added to the collection of important information that we need to identify risk. And anti-violence workers are often using it as a basis of their intake or their documentation in their organization. So it's pretty consistent. It's nice to see it consistently used and to have a common language. The 19 risk factors that we use in BC are derived from years of research in Canada and the US about domestic violence inquests, inquiries, and death review committees, and is compatible with ODERA and others used. There's no contradictions that are used with any of the risk factors that we know of, so they work well. And they were actually first used in Alberta, and I think they were called FEVER, before they were adopted in BC by the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General, along with their subject matter expert partners from the police, municipal police, RCMP, community corrections, and MCFD, and others. The best practice is to identify risks and safety protective factors, and it should be ingrained into our program practices, and should be. I know it takes a long time to implement these, but to have the 19 risk factors looked at through the lens of the victim vulnerabilities, and I know some people don't like that term, but I don't know a better way of saying it, factors that can make a woman or the victim more vulnerable, we'll speak to that a little bit further as we go along, but sometimes a risk factor is an extreme risk factor can be mitigated because a woman doesn't have certain vulnerabilities, and that's how we need to look at them. We can't look at the risk factors alone without looking at what strengths and vulnerabilities the victim has. So along with the risk identification during intake, the client should be made aware of safety options and risk reduction strategies. And I think it's very interesting, and in my experience as well, and I hear from people around the province when we're doing training, how much awareness the victim or survivor gains when you go through the risk identification process, so that it's very clear that some of the factors can lead to great danger for her and her children and extended family and the perpetrator. And here's a slide that's it's a little bit of a dense slide, but it's from the it's actually from the domestic violence risk assessment. Is from the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative, talking about ICATs, and they do refer to it as risk assessment versus risk identification. So that's something that needs to be changed. It's too dense to read now, but it is very interesting and gives an overview of what ICATs and probably high-risk domestic violence teams are about. So factors to consider in risk identification and safety planning. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the 19 risk factors, and this is just shown as a sample. It's the template used by ICATs. Police use it on the road. It's the factors, although not in this order, are in the Crown, the domestic violence policies, IPB policy, intimate partner violence policy put out by Crown Counsel. MCFD uses it, and I know a lot of agencies, anti-violence agencies, have this as part of their risk assessment or their intake process, sorry. And again, it was designed or it was steered by the Public Safety and Solicitor General Police Services in conjunction with many other experts. The dynamite sticks that you see represent a factor that is more risk, statistically or using evidence, they're more likely to be a part of or present in a domestic homicide or serious bodily harm incident, and they need special attention. But again, one of the important pieces is that the 19 risk factors not be used as a checklist, because it's we as human beings or as logical thinkers, we tend to want to go to adding up scores and finding out if it's risk. But it really needs to be a discussion using critical thinking at your ICAT table or in your organization or in your high-risk domestic violence team, so you can talk about the risk factors, decide about whether to share more information or what's recent and relevant, and decide what factors can mitigate the risk that's obvious. And the slide that I'm on now, slide 20, talks about, it really makes me think about the complexity of domestic violence, how they have, how the complainant's perception of future violence means that if she is afraid, we need to pay special attention. But if she's not afraid and minimizes the risk, or extremely minimizes the risk, that can be a risk factor too. So it's kind of paradoxical, as are many of them. That's why there needs to be a conversation and a consultation with your community partners, not just using this like a checklist. And again, there's more examples of the risk factors. We don't have time to discuss all the factors, but it's very important to have an understanding, and you can learn about them from your local police officers and community corrections have a very comprehensive understanding of these 19 risk factors, as do NCFD, and probably many of you do as well. And just sort of something that's interesting too is that most of the risk factors focus on the perpetrator's behavior, which after having done many decades of, or not many decades, but a few decades of anti-violence work, it's refreshing that it's not all about the victim and what she has to change and how she has to rearrange her life, although of course that happens. But we're looking at the perpetrator's behavior, and it also provides us with an opportunity to intervene and create some safety and support for him that may reduce the risk of serious bodily harm or death to the victims. And weapons and firearms. I think it's a surprise. People are surprised that the weapons and firearms don't have a dynamite stick by it. And I believe it's because so many people have weapons, and even people who commit domestic violence have weapons, but they don't necessarily use them in a lethal act. But I stand to be corrected on that, but that's my understanding. So now the next slides go on to talk about what's really critical to assessing risk and identifying risk is really change and destabilization and things that change in the relationship, even if it seems like a good change, like her going back to school, her finding new friends or getting a new job. It can be a factor that unseats the somewhat stability that's in the relationship, and things can go from bad to worse. So just sort of getting to know a little bit about their life, where things are going, what the plans are. And I think we talk about it a bit more later, but one of the factors that are incredibly prevalent in so many domestic homicides is that the woman is planning to leave, or has left. So most women are killed within 2 months of when they leave their relationship, which is interesting that most of us, if it was our family member or even working in an agency, is trying to encourage her to leave when she knows that she's going to be unsafe if she does. Doesn't mean she shouldn't leave, just means that we need to provide extra safety around that time. And talking about, and again, talking about issues that are, or factors that can destabilize. Really anything can destabilize. Unemployment, loss of identity in the perpetrator, deaths in the family, retirement. And this isn't for the general population, but for people who, if there's a big power imbalance in the relationship, and if the perpetrator is especially controlling and wants control over his life as well, these are factors we need to pay attention to. Doesn't mean women shouldn't leave, but we need to help her leave safely if that's what she wants. This is a slide that the ICATS did some research a few years ago. At that time, there was only 23 ICATS, and these are some of the risk factors that were prevalent or that were obvious in the research. And it was reassuring to us that it was consistent with what was found in the ODERA and other frameworks in Canada, and to me, it validated that ICATS are on the right track. And this is very, to me, it really says a lot. This was a coroner's death review that was relatively recent, and I think they reviewed about 100 files, perhaps a bit more, where there was a domestic homicide. And as we know, most of the victims were women. However, some of the men who were killed as well, they were killed by a male perpetrator. They were a new partner, extended family, sometimes male children. So it's the 78 versus 22 versus 78% women versus 22% men doesn't even really tell the whole story, even though we know that domestic violence happens in relationships where the perpetrator is a male or a female. Homicide is rare, and most of the victims of homicide are women. And something really startling is that 2/3 of the homicide victims had domestic violence in their past, but only 1/3 had ever reported to police. So this is why we need to use the community and the knowledge that anti-violence organizations and others have to be able to share in a legal way, an ethical way, share information so that police have the information that they need in high-risk cases, and then they can do what they need to do, and also the anti-violence organization can have information that they need as well, and child welfare. And only 10 of the victims out of the 101, let's say, I'm not sure of the exact number, had a protection order, which was, as a response community, we need to do better. And now that's my slides for now. On to Laura.
Good morning. We're going to talk a little bit now about looking at this more through the lens of an anti-violence worker. And we'll look at some tools, and we'll take a closer look at how you might explore some of those risk factors with your clients. So you're probably familiar with factors to consider when domestic violence safety planning. It's a tool developed for anti-violence workers just to make sure that they're on the same page and looking at the same information as other justice and child protection system partners, so that we have a shared understanding of the risks associated with an increased likelihood of future violence. It's available online. In the PDF that was sent out is the link. This webinar will be available afterwards on the EVA BC website and through MPSSG. So you'll be able to look at these links. You should be able to click them in the PDF, but all you really have to do is just Google BC Summary of Domestic Violence Risk Factors, and you can find this tool. You can also call me or email me anytime at Ending Violence Association. So the first page looks like this. This is just a screenshot, and it's 6 pages long. And it outlines 19 domestic violence risk factors within 4 categories: relationship factors, abuser factors, victim safety factors, and system factors. So the victim safety factors and the system factors are significant to anti-violence workers. They're important considerations for safety planning. And so we'll talk more about these factors. We're going to take a look at a sample risk identification tool. But these victim safety factors include relative social powerlessness. Is she an Indigenous woman living in the downtown east side? Is she a recent immigrant? Is she living in poverty? It looks at the level of personal support. Does she have a support system? Is she new in the community? Has the abuser been isolating her from her friends and family? It looks at pregnancy. We know that pregnancy puts women at risk for increased violence and sometimes for the beginning of physical abuse. We look at the impacts of the abuse. Has she been told for so many years that she can't survive without him and she's worthless and she's stupid, that she's internalized these messages? She might even have sustained a traumatic brain injury at one point as a result of a blow to the head. Is she financially dependent on the abuser? We know that that holds many women in abusive relationships and causes many women to return to abusive relationships. And that, as all of us on the front lines know, has become a greater and greater problem with the current housing crisis and the inability to find any kind of affordable housing. System factors include the availability and accessibility of services. Are you on a reserve with no services? Are you in an urban area where you can access services? Are you in a rural area where you can't? Provision of information. Do you even know these services are available? Are you even aware of some of the dynamics of abuse? And as Debbie has mentioned, the coordination of services, and we'll talk more about this through the webinar, the coordination of services is really vitally important to helping to maintain women's safety. So we'll take a look at this sample relationship violence risk identification form, and Ishtar Women's Resource Society in Langley was kind enough to share their form with us for use in this webinar. They've also given me permission to provide people with the template that they can then tweak to their own use and put in their own agency logos. So again, you can contact me at the Ending Violence Association and I can provide you with that template. So this is the first page. And remember that icon, which in this case looks a little different than the dynamite stick we saw earlier, but that icon also represents a relationship of risk factor that you must pay special attention to, that research has shown there's a higher chance of escalation, severe relationship violence, and possibly even homicide. And so right off the bat, we look at the relationship history and the current status. As Debbie said earlier, past or present recent separation is a major risk factor. And ironically, we may be working with our clients' families, may be working with their family members for them, encouraging them to leave that relationship, and then we breathe a sigh of relief. Whoa, phew, she's safe. She's not. She may not. She may be at risk, at increased risk, for some time, at least some months. We look at, has there been an escalation in the abuse, in the frequency and the intensity of the violence towards either the survivor, her family members, her pet, or another person? We ask, if we're still looking at relationship factors, we ask if there's children exposed. Are the children under 19 living in the family home? Is there a custody guardianship dispute? That's a major red flag as well. Who are the biological parents? Is the offender the biological parent? It's probably more specifically what we're looking at. We look at threats. Has the offender ever threatened to kill or harm the complainant, a family member, another person, children, or maybe a pet? And we look at forced sex. Has the offender ever forced sex on the complainant? And when you're doing an intake or you're working with a client that you haven't managed to establish a relationship with yet, it's kind of hard to ask them this question. So take care in how you phrase it. You might want to use wording such as, has he ever made you do anything sexually that you were uncomfortable with? So we're now on the page 3, and we're looking at 6, and you'll notice that this again has an icon beside it, strangling, choking, or biting. Has the offender ever strangled, choked, or bitten the complainant, or, to the best of your knowledge, of previous intimate partners? Again, this is a serious red flag, and when this shows up in your intake, there's cause for concern there. We look at jealous, obsessive, and/or controlling behaviors. Have they ever shown extreme jealousy? Are they extremely obsessive? Do they say things like, if I can't have you, no one else can? Do they control as much as possible of her behaviors, her finances, her comings and goings, what she wears? Again, this has an icon beside it. It's another serious factor to consider. We look at stalking. Has the offender stalked or harassed the complainant or a previous intimate partner? Do you have concerns about technology or cell phone safety? So the technology safety is a really growing concern among our clients and among anti-violence workers, and it's beyond the scope of this short webinar, but there are some helpful resources at the end of this PowerPoint. There's a lot of resources at the end of this PowerPoint for future reference, and BCSTH, the British Columbia Society of Transition Houses, is doing some really excellent work around technology safety. So then we start to look at the complainant's perceptions of risk. And you'll likely remember Debbie saying earlier that if your client is very afraid of the perpetrator, that should be taken really seriously. And there's nothing more chilling than to have a client sit in your office and say, I'm afraid that he might kill me. If she's telling you that, listen. Then you really need to come up with the best possible safety plan as soon as possible. However, as Debbie also mentioned, be aware that your client may be minimizing or denying the level of danger she's in, the level of abuse that she's suffering, possibly as a psychological defense mechanism. She just can't let herself think about that or have some growing awareness about that. So sometimes a really important part of our work is to stress to a client that we are very concerned for her safety and why. And I will often use a tool like this one we're looking at now. I've been known to sit and work through it with a client and then come and sit beside her and show her how many yes boxes are ticked off, how many of those yes boxes have that explosive icon beside them, how there's research that establishes that these are serious risk factors, and that after having looked at this and worked through this with her, I am genuinely concerned for her safety, and if she has children, for her children's safety. And that's a very difficult thing to have to tell someone. So we also look at, in these intakes and these risk identification processes, we look at the offender's history. We look at their domestic violence history. Do they have a history of stalking, criminal harassment, violence, abuse, sexual assault, threats against previous partners, their children, pets, or other family members? And if the woman is new in the relationship, she may not have this information yet. She may have heard rumors. He may have even told her, what a horrible person his ex was and how crazy she was and all the horrible lies she made up about him. It is possible to check court services online if you know what community he was in and see if anything recent's showing up on court services online. And I know a growing number of young women are actually using that when they meet someone. They're actually running him on court services online to see if anything's showing up. And I've been with a young client when she did that, and some pretty scary things did show up. We look at court orders. Has the offender ever violated a court order? And particularly something like a no contact order. Is the offender presently bound by any court orders? That can be pretty telling too. We look at alcohol and drug use. Does the offender have a history of drug or alcohol abuse? And we look at employment instability. And you'll notice that there's an icon here as well. Is the offender unemployed or experiencing work or financial problems? In that really tragic Andrew Barry case where he stabbed his two young girls, 4 and 6, at Christmas of 2017, it's now coming out in the trial that he was unemployed and he was experiencing some significant financial problems. His power had been cut off. He was about to be evicted. If someone had been working with that family, that might have been one of the factors that would have sort of aroused some concern and maybe prompted even an ICAT. We look at mental illness and/or suicidal ideation. You'll notice both of these, 14 and 15, again have the icons. Does the offender have a history of mental illness? This could be depression, this could be bipolar, paranoia. Lots of times my clients will tell me, well, he's never been diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure, I know darn well that he's depressed and I suspect, He may be bipolar. And I really want to stress, this is not to say that people that are bipolar are a risk to themselves or others. It's just another factor that we're looking at when we look at the big picture. We also need to look at, and this is very important, this deserves its own icon, has the offender threatened or attempted suicide? If you hear that, be concerned, be deeply concerned. And we want to keep on top of things. This really underlines again the importance of revisiting safety plans, staying on top of changes in risk factors. Did he just lose his job? Did his father just die? And working as much as we can with the client's permission collaboratively to keep sharing information so that we're more likely to be aware of something. Because a major loss or a negative life event might just tip the scales and turn this into a much more dangerous situation. We look at access to weapons and firearms. Have they used, and we want to know, have they used weapons? Have they threatened to use weapons against the complainant, a family member, children, or an animal? And do they have access to weapons and firearms? And as Debbie said, weapons and firearms are very common in Canadian homes, particularly in more rural areas. So the very fact that there's a firearm in the house may or may not be a risk factor. If he has threatened to use it or if he has used it, now we have some very real cause for concern. So here's where an anti-violence worker would concentrate more than, say, maybe an investigating officer. Because there's a number of factors that contribute to a woman's vulnerability, and conversely, they contribute to her safety. And it's very important for anti-violence workers to explore these factors with their clients and to take them into consideration when safety planning. And Debbie, feel free to speak to any of these. So you would want to ask your client, does she fear for the safety of her friends or relatives? And again, if she says yes, take that very seriously. And very often, a perpetrator will threaten not just the woman herself, but will threaten to harm her family or will harm her family. Has she taken additional security measures to keep herself and her family safe? And when you ask her that, you'll get a sense of her level of fear again. Is she at a place where she's thinking, oh my God, I need to put in an alarm. I need to put gravel under the window so I'll hear if anybody's walking out there. You may also hear, no, I'm not too worried. And then you may be wondering, is she just unable to take this all in? And do we have to talk about the risk with her that she might be at, that she's maybe in denial about? Does she have access to safe transportation? If she needs to get out of there, can she get out of there, particularly if she needs to get out of there in a hurry? We want to know, is she pregnant? Was she recently pregnant? We want to know specifically, was she assaulted while pregnant? Again, that's one of our risk factors. We really do need to explore, are there ongoing guardianship and access issues regarding the children? That is very, very much a hot point. Does she fear losing her child or children? And very often perpetrators will say, if you leave me, I'll get a lawyer. You'll never see those kids again. I'll get custody. And sadly, very often perpetrators have more access to money. They've often planned it that way, and to a good lawyer than your client might. So it causes her very real concern. So you can ask her that. Do you fear losing your child or your children? He may have also said to her, I'm going to tell the ministry you're abusive. I'm going to tell the ministry you're an alcoholic. I'm going to tell the ministry you're crazy. They'll take your kids away. Is she financially able to take care of herself and her children? We mentioned earlier that, so very many women stay in or return to abusive relationships because of a lack of resources, financial and otherwise. Has she recently started dating or entered into a new relationship? That puts that will often be a game changer for the ex who's maybe been holding on to some hope that they'll get back together, and they may snap. It's a time when she really needs to be extra careful, and quite possibly, depending on the perpetrator, her new partner may need to be extra careful. You want to ask her about her support. Does she have family? Does she have friends? Does she have community support? Does she part of a spiritual community? And perpetrators work very hard throughout the relationship to isolate women from family, from friends, from their community. And it helps to marginalize them and keep them in the relationship. Does she fear betraying her family or her spiritual community or values? Are her values or the values of her spiritual community or her social community that you just be nicer? If he's like that, just calm him down, just be nicer, just give in, that you keep the family together no matter what? Is she socially isolated and cut off from friends and family? Is she new to the area and she wouldn't have a chance to learn of resources? She wouldn't have had a chance to build a support system? Does she live in an isolated area? Often, many of you will work with clients where it may take the police 45 minutes to get there. So how does she call 911 and get an immediate response? Does she use coping mechanisms like drugs and or alcohol? We call that self-medicating, and it does serve that purpose, but it can also sometimes interfere with her ability to keep herself safe and her children safe. Does she have any mental health concerns, including PTSD symptoms? We know a lot more now than we used to about how years and years of abuse can cause PTSD, and repeated abuse, often from different perpetrators throughout the lifetime, can cause complex PTSD. And then that can interfere with your functioning as an adult and make you more vulnerable to falling into or staying into abusive situations. Is she physically or intellectually disabled? And I mentioned earlier, she may even have a traumatic brain injury, and it may even be undiagnosed as a result of violence and abuse. Is she Indigenous? Is she an immigrant? Is she a refugee? There's so many intersecting things there that might make her more vulnerable, that might lead to her having less support, to her having less access to services. And along the same lines, has she experienced persistent and or pervasive gender inequality? So these are the factors that we're looking at specific to the woman. This is the last page of this particular risk identification tool, and you'll see there's a spot there for notes as well, because things will come up that weren't on the checklist, or things will come up that sort of made you go, oh, we need to pay attention to that. So some other things that aren't on this checklist are the survivor's inability or reluctance to disclose the abuse at all. That's a very difficult thing to do. She may be too embarrassed. She may be too ashamed. She may have been threatened. If you tell anyone, this is what's going to happen to you, or this is what I'm going to do to the kids, or the ministry's going to take the kids. Also not on this list is something we mentioned about the lack of resources, such as affordable housing, and if she has children, such as childcare, access to childcare. And also society's sort of, lots of people get to walk around blissfully unaware of the dynamics of violence and abuse. And that can lead to things like victim blaming and, not recognizing or ignoring warning signs. And it can lead to a lack of intervention and a lack of resources for perpetrators as well. So there is, I think this deserves, although it's been mentioned in the tools, I think this deserves some separate conversation. There's a very well-established link between animal abuse and domestic violence, and actually between animal abuse and even serial murderers. There's a strong correlation between cruelty to animals and cruelty to people. And 89% of women with pets living in domestic violence situations reported in one survey that their pets were also abused. That's 89%. That's pretty much 9 out of 10. 56%, and this is more recent, of women in Canadian shelters to escape abuse reported delaying leaving an abusive situation due to concerns for their pet's safety. So women will stay in abusive situations because they're very concerned about what will happen if I have to leave the home and leave the pet in the home, because we know that while a growing number of transition houses are working really hard to accommodate pets and other agencies, women with pets have a harder time even finding a bed in a transition house. Abusers who also abuse pets are more dangerous, they're more controlling, and they use more forms of violence than abusers who do not. And abuse of animals often starts in childhood, and it can be a way for an abuser to experiment, with exerting control over another living being, sometimes because they themselves, are being abused or controlled. So when you're working with a woman who's experiencing or fleeing abuse, it's really important to ask if she has pets. Especially if you've just met this woman, she may be more willing to talk about what's happened to her pets and her livestock. When we're talking pets, we're also talking farm animals. We're also talking livestock. They may be more willing to open up and talk to you about that when they first meet you than what's happened to themselves, especially, in these early stages when you're building trust. The National Link Coalition is an American organization that works to stop violence against people and animals, and it really works to educate about how very strong and how well established that link is. And it's definitely on the radar, growingly. Certainly the BCSPCA is very aware of this and doing work around this. And all kinds of legislation is coming in the States, and it's really much more on the radar that animal protection workers and anti-violence workers need to communicate better and to be more aware that if you're going into an animal protection situation, there's very likely a domestic violence situation happening there as well, and vice versa. So the National Link Coalition is recommending that anti-violence workers routinely include 3 questions about the presence of welfare in animals when you're doing your intake and interviews and risk assessments. And as we said earlier, really best practice is to do that risk assessment at your earliest possible opportunity, ideally first contact with the new client. And so these 3 questions are there pets in the home? How does each family member treat them? And do you worry about something bad happening to them? And so the answers to those questions can be really telling. So there are some critical times for risk identification, and I'm going to hand it back to Debbie, and she will talk about that.
Thanks, Laura. So, as we talked about before, there are the critical times in the course of the process that are of domestic violence and women leaving and responding that are especially important. But it's not possible to cover every circumstance that can be addressed in a safety plan. However, something that's really important is to have the woman at the center of the process. It can, from what we've been talking about, it sounds like a very deficit-based approach to looking at domestic violence and a woman's experience. But it's really important to have her at the center of the process and work with her to assess her safety, because she really is the expert and she's been keeping herself safe so far. And one really good example that I've heard recently was someone was working with a woman, and usually when someone's being stalked, or even if they're leaving a bad relationship or in a bad relationship, you suggest or you actually recommend that they vary their routes to work and change the way they go to their mother's house and to just switch it up. But this woman said if she did that, she knew her circumstances well enough that if she did switch it up and she didn't show up on her typical route, she knew her partner would be watching her. that would just escalate things incredibly. So I always learned so much from working with women and working with communities and the nuggets of wisdom, and that really reminded me that we need to keep the woman. She's the expert. She mistakenly believes she can manage the risk, but she has until this point, and she really knows what's going on. So I think we really need to include her experience and her wisdom for how she's managed so far into her safety plan, and to really listen to her. And talking about some of the, and a reminder too that we can sometimes make things worse in our efforts to help. We give brochures and cards and information, or intervene, or she may be seen coming into our services, and that can really escalate what's happening for her. The perpetrator, sorry, I'm kind of lost here. If the perpetrator finds one of our information cards or a police card or something on her person or in her purse, because of course they wouldn't hesitate to go through her purse or belongings, it can really make things terrible for her. So we have to include our response to her in our safety strategies for her. But here's just some examples of when things can really escalate. During any kind of court process, any kind of child welfare intervention, efforts that we encourage and family encourages or even pressures her to make, when she makes moves to empower herself and seek freedom, such as going to school, getting a job, making new friends. And socializing can be seen as a threat, and it can escalate the abuse. So we have to be aware of that, and also we'll make her aware of that as well. Or legal actions such as divorce. When a divorce in particular, he knows it's really final and she's not going to change her mind and come back to him. Property settlement. If a perpetrator is inclined that in this way, in really high risk behavior, he's going to see having property separated and having to liquidate property that may have been in his family for a long time as a real affront to his identity and his esteem, and it's going to destabilize him. Any kind of notifications. And the safety planning based on the risk factors, like the form and the process that Laura identified, is really important. But it's not necessarily appropriate in a crisis situation. In fact, it's not. If it's a crisis situation, of course, the people who respond, police and child welfare, should be engaged. And the process wouldn't necessarily, or shouldn't probably, unless it's an exceptional circumstance, happen all at once. It could be not necessarily upon intake. There might be some important information you gather, but you wouldn't interrogate her about all of the risk factors. It could be a process that goes along. You might just ask her some of the more important ones, unless it seems like she's really engaged in the process. It's an opportunity to discover really important safety information and help to address each of the safety risk factors or make a referral. And we need to take cues from the survivor. She's done a really good job to this point and been really resourceful and used ingenuity for keeping her and her kids safe. But women mistakenly believe they can manage the risk, and sadly, the evidence shows that they can't. Talking about the importance of collaboration and coordination, this has been an item on death review panels, a recommendation on coroner's inquests, and we've known this for decades now, and it's been recommended. And I think BC's done a really good job of having coordination supported by all of the government, all of the partners, everyone who is recommended to play on a Violence Against Women Coordination Committee, a high-risk team, or an ICAT. And it's really important to think that, going back to the coroner's death review, that a third of the women had no contact with police, and a very small number had protection orders. So anti-violence workers and shelters and people who work with women and kids have lots of information that other service providers may not know. And especially in the highest risk situations, that's a reason to coordinate. There's many other reasons to coordinate as well for addressing systemic issues, but coordinating to share information is a very compelling reason for that. And we need to stay aware, stay really alert and share information on relevant changes in the circumstances. So even after, if a case has been reviewed by a domestic violence unit or an ICAT or some kind of collaboration, even if it's found to not be highest risk, things can change on a dime. So, and domestic violence is so dynamic, we need to monitor it on an ongoing basis. Somebody needs to be in touch with the victim and ideally the perpetrator too, to just take note of any changes and see what's happening in their life. And this goes on to this is included in some resources at the end, so I won't go over the slide, but it's just another resource that's very, very helpful from the Canadian Domestic Violence Prevention Institute. This is a sample taken from the Protocol for Highest Risk Domestic Violence, or what we refer to as the VAUR 2010 policy, because there were, I think, 2 editions that had preceded it. But this was the version where there was the need or the benefits of coordination were really put forward, and members of government agencies and the programs that are connected to them and anti-violence agencies were encouraged strongly to collaborate, especially to look at highest risk domestic violence. And do we have a link to this, Laura? I think we have a link to this
in the resources.
Thanks, and it can be found on the government website as well. And it talks about the responsibilities that all of us have to, including child welfare partners, to play a part in responding to domestic violence, and also to collaborate to form those relationships of ideally trust and sometimes friendship that will really grease the wheels of information sharing and a good response. Again, I think this is in one of the resources at the back, so I won't go over it again, but it talks about how the families are often involved in multiple systems, and thinking about the Peter Lee case in the tragedy in Victoria, where so many people and agencies were involved with that family, and everybody did their job well, or according to what according to what's recommended, but not sharing information really enabled them to fall through the cracks. And there's many other circumstances that even those that aren't highest risk, having a really good collaborative response helps to seal those cracks and make it a much more seamless response and informed response. And again, it goes talking more about it, about the creating safety plans. I think we have this resource at the back too, Laura. If not, we can send it to you. It underlines again how important collaboration and coordination is. And the best practices, when we're talking about information sharing, it doesn't mean we have to open up the vault and share all information we know about the situation. We need to really make sure we stick to relevant and usually recent information. And some of it can be very gray and requires critical thinking as a group. For example, health information may seem irrelevant and shouldn't be shared, but there may be certain risk factors that reveal that it's very important to share information about a health circumstance, especially if it makes her more vulnerable or creates some uncertainty or discord in the family. So nothing is necessarily off limits. Ideally, we have consent from the victim, and it's a best practice. And lots of information sharing isn't possible if the woman isn't there to provide the information that's not known to anyone. But legally, we all can share, even for government people, provincial government people, even if they suspect domestic violence. There's the legislation to support the sharing. So it's quite a low barrier, quite a low bar for sharing information, but I haven't I don't know of circumstances where it's been misused, and people are very aware of and very careful about the information that they share. There should be, with every contract holder, everyone who does contract and business with the government, our legislation says that we have to have a designate, a privacy officer in our agency who makes decisions about sharing information. I do know, however, that with many frontline workers aren't aware if there is someone, and sometimes that's one person who shares many roles. So they may not know, but it's a good time to inquire about find out who your privacy officer is. And if time permits, if you can consult with a supervisor just to have more heads, more brains on the one decision, and to just make sure you document. Everybody needs to document about decisions you make about sharing information or not sharing information, or referring or not referring, and have somebody from your organization, if you operate that way, to sign off on the or to give you permission to share the records or share information from the records. And it's always best when you're starting out in a collaboration, and I think most ICATs have done this, and high-risk domestic violence teams and other bodies that collaborate, they develop and share an agreement, and keep in mind that the information sharing, especially if it's without consent, is a really rare privilege, and we have to be sure to not exploit it, and it must be used carefully. As well as being unlawful to unnecessarily share information, this action can alienate survivors, putting them at greater risk in the long run. If they feel like they've been betrayed, they may never contact our services again, even when they're in danger, or they may not call the police again or avoid child welfare. Not to say that that's a guarantee that won't happen anyways, but just to it's to be really transparent and really practice good information sharing. Hygiene is really important. So cautions, even though we have a great risk identification tool in the 19 risk factors, there are some cautions. And it's not an exact science, and it's not an assessment even, but it's a tool that we can use to communicate and for building a risk management plan for survivors, perpetrators, and community, because that's the whole point. It's not to come up with a diagnosis through a risk assessment and to label people. It's to create a safety plan to keep everybody, including the perpetrator, extended family, and, as Laura said, pets and livestock and communities safer. It's very important to remember the scope and why we're doing the risk identification in the first place. And again, it helps her, as Laura said earlier, it helps her explore her risks, and she can be an active part in developing her safety plan, and we have to rely on her knowledge and her understanding and her experience in her relationship to build the building blocks of the safety or risk management plan. And they're not a reminder that they're a means and an end to an end to create safety. They're not an action in themselves. The risk identification is pointless for this purpose unless it's going to be part of a risk management plan. There probably is very good reasons for doing risk assessments, but for the purpose of this, it's to create safety for everyone involved, and only as a part of a risk management and safety strategy. And survivors might see if we share almost everything, although we can't share third-party information that we come across about the perpetrator, and vice versa, of course. But survivors might see the risk identification checklist or a tool as a cookie-cutter approach and feel like they're not understood. So to have lots of conversation, lots of helping her understand what the purpose of it is, and it's not to just oversimplify her life and to check off things that are present, but it's to create a picture that can be helpful to keep her safer. And it can also help us create a false sense of security if we and consequently we miss a crucial piece of information about a woman's risk. And I think even if we do collaborative risk identification, sometimes we can get tunnel vision, and that's why it's so, as individuals, it's so helpful to have the team to help us see things a different way, even if it's not the way we agree with. And risk identification tools and services in general can be disempowering, and the woman may believe that the worker knows, or the person who's doing the risk assessment or the risk identification, that they know better than she does about her safety needs. And so she doesn't trust her intuition and her instinct, which has kept her safe to this point. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
So it's Laura again. I'm going to talk a little bit about safety planning practice and principles. And as Deb said at the beginning of this webinar, in the time that we have allotted to us today, nobody's going to be a risk identification expert. Nobody's going to be a safety planning expert. We can just touch on these things. We have a lot of resources at the end. And there's time for question and answers at the end. And so we'll talk a little bit about safety planning. And I'm available at the Ending Violence Association of BC for people who have questions or concerns or want to debrief or consult moving forward after this. So safety planning differs from risk assessment and risk management. A risk assessment is used to identify the risk factors present and to evaluate the potential for repeated violence or homicide. A risk assessment is typically completed by a service provider based on information about the aggressor and/or the woman. Safety planning is related to risk assessment because the strategies developed address the risk factors identified. Additionally, risk management involves developing strategies to reduce the risk of the aggressor acting violently. For example, close monitoring, treatment for substance abuse. And it's interesting, I remember a conversation I had with someone from a domestic violence unit embedded with the RCMP once, and she mentioned to me casually that they'd sort of almost stumbled across this approach where very often in the kind of high-risk cases that go to a domestic violence unit, the perpetrator will repeatedly breach things like no contact conditions. And they had one of those files. It was very high risk and he was breaching a lot. And one of the RCMP just thought to check in with the perpetrator and say, you know, what's going on with you? You know, you're breaching a lot. There's, you know, what's going on with you? And the perpetrator opened up, and there were some of the factors we've talked about earlier happening with him, homelessness type, you know, lots of struggles. And so they took the time and they made the effort to listen to him and put some resources in place, help connect him with resources, and he quit breaching. And so they continued to use that technique, and they continued to pay more attention to, and I think this is the direction we should all be moving in, to, you know, also looking at reducing the risk of the aggressor acting violently by trying to address some of their issues. So safety planning strategies are specific to the woman. Risk management strategies are specific to the aggressor. And therefore, it's really important that these two strategies don't conflict. And this is from a resource, again, that's at the end of our webinar, Domestic Violence Risk Assessment, Informing Safety Planning and Risk Management. So, as we've said, a perpetrator's behaviors and their actions, they can't be predicted, they can't be guaranteed with risk identification. There is not a way to say to a woman, oh, you know, don't worry, nothing's going to happen, or, oh my God, you should be so afraid, like, move to Mexico tomorrow because you're in such real danger. We have guidelines, we have tools, but we can't predict or guarantee anything, good or bad. So it's really essential to have a safety plan in place to increase the safety of the survivor and, of course, of her children. because safety is a really complex concept. It involves being free of controlling tactics on that entire violence continuum in financial control, emotional abuse. And for a lot of women, it's a lifelong process with incremental changes, setbacks. We know the statistics about how many times a woman, tries to leave or leaves and returns before she actually becomes free of an abusive relationship. And we also know that lots of women choose to or are forced to stay in abusive relationships for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. And sometimes you'll often hear in your work, and you'll hear it from when people ask you what you do for a living, why doesn't she just leave? And you'll hear people say, if he hit me once, bang, that'd be it. I'd be out of there. And we know it's not that simple. And one of the best ways I've found to describe this to people who don't understand it, including some of the professionals we work with, is an analogy, and I don't know who to give credit for this, saying you don't take action to solve a problem until the pain of the problem is bigger than the pain of the solution. I've also found this is really helpful to use with clients when they're making some major decisions about whether they're going to stay, whether they're going to leave, what their next steps are. You don't take action to solve a problem until the pain of the problem is bigger than the pain of the solution. So this woman has a really painful problem. She is in a relationship where she's being emotionally abused, quite possibly physically abused. Her finances may be controlled. She may be being isolated. That's extremely painful. But look at how painful that solution is. She's going to lose her home. She's probably going to live in poverty, many women. She may not be able to find a place to live. She may have to give up her pets. She may have to separate her children from their father. There may be a custody battle. She may have been facing threats for years about what will happen to her if she ever leaves, and what will happen, to the children. She may be part of a family or a community that feels it's her job to keep that family together. She's probably had years of attacks on her self-esteem that have convinced her she can't make it on her own. The abuser she's probably been through that honeymoon cycle many times where he pleads with her to remain or to come back. He promises things will get better. She may conversely be also facing threats. If you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. And of course, it's really embarrassing. When you leave a situation and people start asking why. So that's one heck of a painful solution. And so it really reinforces that, we need to be with women where they are and be aware that it can be a lifelong process and just be with them where they are, be very, very aware of how painful this solution is. And very often, that solution is more painful than the problem. And so we need to work more with them to stay safe in their relationships. So when you are safety planning, those safety plans should be developed as soon as possible. And as Debbie stressed, they really need to be developed in partnership with your client. Always empower her to take ownership of her plan. Make it really clear that it belongs to her, that she has control over it, that she is making these decisions. Discuss the purpose of risk identification and safety planning with her. Share any concerns you have for her and her children's safety, and then invite her to take part in this process. And as Debbie also said earlier, it's really critical that safety planning be done in a way that acknowledges and builds on the woman's strengths, her unique knowledge of her own situation, and all the ways that she has uncovered, and sometimes without thinking them through, just intuitively, that she's discovered and uncovered to keep herself and her children safer. So begin by asking her if she already has a safety plan and what the details are. And she may not be calling it that, but she's probably doing a lot of things consciously to keep herself and her children safe. So decisions about any specific strategies should always be made by the survivor. And Our role as a support worker, as an anti-violence worker, is to facilitate a discussion with the survivor, to think strategically about how they will stay safe across all aspects of their life. We're offering information, we're offering resources, we're offering possible options for consideration, but she is making the decisions. Because the woman is the expert on her life. She owns her safety plan. The use of violence is the perpetrator's choice. They must be held accountable for their violence. She is never responsible for her partner's violence. And sometimes she will need to be reminded that because she's probably been told for years, look what you made me do. If you weren't like this, then I wouldn't have to do that. So the goal in safety planning is to reduce the risks. It's not to predict the violence. We're not good at that. And to underline and reinforce for the woman, if she's living with violence, that she's evaluating her risk on a continual basis. And to listen to her own instincts and really validate the skills they've already developed to keep them safe, help identify them. And Debbie mentioned earlier an example of a woman who is doing things to keep herself safe in rather an unconventional way by not varying her way to work. And it reminded me of examples of very often when there's a no contact order and your client will allow the perpetrator to have contact with her anyways, or she may even contact the perpetrator herself. And sometimes our system partners will get extremely frustrated and annoyed with that. Sometimes even our coworkers will. But she may need that contact with the perpetrator to evaluate her risk at that moment. What kind of mood is he in? How angry is he? What is he threatening me? Is he now at that phase where he's sorry and he's remorseful and he's promising to do better? Can I, relax a little bit? Can I maybe sleep tonight? That's an example of how a woman is the expert and how a woman needs to guide her own safety plan. And as we've said, no one agency is going to have all the relevant information, and information sharing with the client's consent and knowledge whenever possible is really integral to enhanced coordination and collaboration in really high-risk cases, and it really increases the effectiveness at safety planning. I've been at tables where pieces have come out from probation or from mental health that, my client didn't know or I didn't know, that have been really valuable in, assessing where the perpetrator is at now and assessing possible ways to move forward with both him and her to keep them both safer. Interventions, when there are interventions, they require a really good understanding of what we know can be really complex dynamics of power and control. Women with children, of course, need to include them in their safety plans. A child's safety and well-being is integrally linked with the safety of the mother. Older children can have their own safety plans. They may require their own safety plans. And there's information on safety planning with children in the resource slides at the end of this webinar. And as we mentioned, really ensure too, as much as possible, that family pets and farm animals are included in any safety plans. And there's many, many women that will be forced to stay on the farm or on the ranch because those animals are dependent on them. Besides her children, other people in a woman's life may be at risk from the perpetrator. Remember to take the safety of others, such as new partners, close friends and family, especially someone that she may be staying with or that he suspects may be sheltering her, co-workers. There have been horror stories, we all know them, we've had them happen in most communities, where a co-worker has been hurt or killed trying to protect a woman when the abusive ex-partner or partner has come to hunt her down on the job site. Landlords, especially if there may be in a duplex kind of situation or if she's in a basement suite, landlords may be at risk. Any neighbor that intervenes or tries to help protect her may be at risk. They all may need safety plans as well. Well, there's standard factors and there's helpful templates for safety planning. Every plan's got to be individualized for that woman's particular situation. women living with a perpetrator, women planning to leave a perpetrator, and women who have already left a perpetrator. They're all going to need different components in their safety plans. Women living in remote areas or on reserve, as we mentioned earlier, they can't call 911, very many of them, the way someone in an urban setting can. They're going to need a different plan than women in urban settings. There is more likely to be a weapon in the home. There's less likely to be somewhere safe close by that she can escape to. Women working outside of the home may also need a safety plan for the workplace. And workplaces are actually legally responsible for trying to ensure the safety of their employees. And so very often an important part of a safety plan is to involve the workplace. And that's for their protection and the woman's protection. Women living with disabilities, they're much more at risk for being abused in a relationship. And they may face a lot of additional barriers to seeking safety. Is there a transition house, that's physically accessible to them? Do they need daily care? Is their abuser their caregiver? Lots of different challenges and barriers survivors face when they're seeking to either stay safe in a relationship or to leave in a relationship. And as we've stressed, these challenges and these barriers, they often keep the woman living with the perpetrator, or they cause the woman to return to that situation. When you're safety planning with the client, remember that this process might be really stressful and overwhelming for her. It's going to cause her to think about her risk factors. She may be looking at this risk identification tool that you've worked through with her and seeing all those boxes checked, and she can't keep the denial at bay anymore, and she's really realizing the danger she's in, and probably even worse for her, the danger that her children are in. So remember, keep in mind that this could be a very stressful process for her. Take it slowly. Strive to find a balance between being supportive, being compassionate, being non-judgmental, being with her where she is, starting where she is. You can't move on from there until you spend some time there with her. Be unhurried, but also try and get as much of that information as you can, and identify risk which she may not be aware of or realize the significance of. And once you become really familiar with those risk factors, you can work that risk identification process into a conversation without sounding like and looking like you're ticking things off on a checklist, or that you're guiding the conversation, along this certain path. You can especially get very skilled at that on the phone. You can work these questions in a very natural way. And I think when we're talking about how doing safety plans can be really stressful for your client, I think we really also need to acknowledge and spend some time thinking about how stressful that can be for us. It's incredibly difficult to connect with the client emotionally and get a sense of the fear she lives with, get a sense of what nights are like for her, lying awake going, what's that sound? Having to tell your client not to wear a scarf around her neck because that might be something that the abuser could use to strangle her. It's really difficult for us too. And the lack of resources, it's not like we can say, oh, well, here you go. Here's the source of income for you, and here's a nice, safe place to live, so you're all good now. We're fighting more and more to find suitable resources to help these women. So I think we also have to keep in mind that this has a real impact on us. We may have nightmares that we're being stalked, that we're being chased, that those noises are outside our windows. So really keep in mind when you work with women at risk that to protect yourself emotionally, to be aware of some of the signs of vicarious trauma, and to do some self-care, to seek clinical supervision, and to take advantage of benefits plans, and really explore and work on how you're impacted by these things. So as we've mentioned earlier, when we talk about the importance of collaboration and everybody being on the same page, safety plans should not simply focus on steps the survivor should take. They got to include steps that systems can take to ensure monitoring of the offender, accountability, and access to resources. And I found it so helpful to have people from probation at the same table, at an ICAT table. And just that kind of sharing of information can really help identify, ways to monitor the offender, ways to keep the offender accountable, and resources for both the offender and the survivor. And this is a quote from an STV counselor, and Debbie also mentioned this earlier. Safety plans need to be revisited on a regular basis because what is safe can change really quickly. Things can change overnight. And if your client has a good sense of what some of the risk factors are, then, that's really helpful that she too can then better gauge, whether her risk is elevated or not. So when you are safety planning, you consider many factors. You consider the perpetrator risk factors. Does he have substance abuse issues? Does he have mental health issues? Did he just lose his job? We look at the woman's individual situation. Does she have support? Does she have substance use issues that she's struggling with? Does she have any kind of financial independence? We look at her support network, or lack thereof sometimes, and we look at the level of system response. And it was really quite striking at the beginning of the webinar when Debbie talked about how less than 1/3 of some of those ICAT files covered in the research had ever even called the police. And if she did call the police, did she get, a helpful response? So we can look a little bit now at a couple of templates. We're going to look at a couple of templates. And one of the things about safety plans, these templates, they tend to focus on women who have left or are preparing to leave a relationship. But as we know, many women choose to stay, or they have no choice but to stay. Or they may have left, but they still have to have continued contact with the perpetrator. They may be sharing parenting. They may be dividing property. They may have some court dates together. So I just wanted to stress that in the resource slides at the end of this webinar, there is an excellent resource called Advocacy Beyond Leaving, and it focuses on supporting women who are going to have continued contact for one reason or another with the perpetrator. So one very common template that you may or may not be familiar with, it's available online through MPSSG. It's a 29-page safety planning booklet, and it's for use by survivors. It's designed to provide women with strategies to increase their safety and the safety of their children. And this link is on this slide, and it's again repeated in our resources at the end. So 29-page booklet for use by survivors. It's fairly comprehensive. And so let's look at the table of contents. There's an introduction, there's a section on taking care of yourself, there's a section on an emergency escape plan, there's a section on creating safer environments at home, in the neighborhood, and at work. There's a section on during a violent incident, steps to take then. There's a section on a child safety plan. And then they have an appendix where they're talking about tracking website activity and resources and a place for notes. And the other half of this slide is a sample page. It's page 19 from this safety planning template, and it specifically talks about, it's the one about creating a safer environment at work. So it has suggestions such as if you're arriving at or leaving work, let someone know you're leaving or you're arriving, when to expect you, call them, let them know you've safely arrived, carry your keys in your hand, get a remote or a keyless entry car door opener. If you can, walk with someone to your car. Always scan that parking lot. Walk around your car, look under the hood to check if anything's been tampered with, and check your brakes. And isn't it sad that women have to live like that? It's just kind of mind-boggling. that women have to take these kind of precautions to just go to work or go home from work. So they also advise you keep your car seats forward so you can look into your car from the outside. So you can see if someone's trying to hide behind your seat. And when parking, reverse the car into the parking spot so that you can make a quick exit if necessary. And I would add to that, and as workers, if you do calls outside of your home, if you go to your workplace, if you go to a client's home, never park like in a driveway where you could be blocked in. And that would be something else to tell a woman, not to park anywhere she could be blocked in. If she does notice she's being followed, she can drive to a place where there are people to support her, like a police station. And if she has problems when she's driving, she can use her cell phone, she can honk her horn, she can drive to a well-lit, open, populated place, she can drive directly to a police station. Underground parking can be really dicey. She might want to consider not parking in underground or anywhere dark and secluded. There are signs that you can get that say call police. You can keep one handy in your car. If you're walking, take a route that's populated and well lit. And as Debbie mentioned earlier, the common advice is to change the patterns of when you arrive and leave work and the routes you take so that you're less likely to your perpetrators will have a harder time finding you. If you use public transit, sit close to the front. If you can have someone meet you at the bus stop when you get home, that's best. And once you get home, let someone know that you've arrived safely. And if you don't arrive safely, have a plan for what they're supposed to do next. So this is just one piece out of this 29-page booklet. And it's just a little piece about arriving at or leaving work. But that will give you a sense of, the details and the types of information that are in this template. The pages, these are pages 20 and 21 from this template on what to do during a violent incident. And so it's just a few tips. They should have an emergency escape plan. They should know the routes, the fastest ways out of, their living space. Is it a window? Is it a door? Is it in the front? Is it in the back? They should try and position themselves near one of those exits or near a phone at least. So if they have to, they can call 911 and try and get into a space where the risk is lower. You don't want to be in the bathroom. And people kind of go, well, why not the bathroom? Well, because you're trapped in there. But also if you're pushed and or you fall, there's so many hard surfaces in there, like at the tub and the sink and the bath and the toilet that you could hit your head on and really sustain a head injury. Try and avoid the garage because there's just too many tools and things that could be used as weapons there. There might be hatchets. And the kitchen, again, there's knives and anywhere near weapons. You don't want to be trapped in a room without access to an outside door. So again, this is really heavy, hard, serious, scary stuff. And so when you're safety planning with a client, you need to really time this out and only give her as much information as she can take in that moment. So maybe just touch on the highlights. It's difficult work for both of you. So the common advice is to yell fire instead of yell help, because apparently people are more likely to respond to a yell of fire than they are to they might be worried about getting involved with someone who needs help. So if you have a fire alarm, you can set it off. That would be great. Make a lot of noise, especially if you're in an apartment. Ideally, you would have talked to your neighbors, break things, turn up the stereo, the TV, hoping that they will call the police. If you're being physically assaulted, just try and protect your head and your face. And, then they make that mention, don't wear scarves. And when you safety plan with children, you should have a code word for them so that they know when they hear that code word to get out of the house and or to call for help. And use your judgment. Very often women will do things they don't really want to do just to defuse the situation. They'll agree with the abuser. They'll, just protect themselves in any way they can and to try and de-escalate the situation. And that's actually good advice. And these are the sort of things also you look for when you're showing them the techniques that they've already come up with, and when you're validating for them, you have all these ways to keep yourself safe. Yes, you feel bad that you gave in. Maybe you feel bad that you didn't, you stopped fighting, or maybe you even made love, but well, let's not call it that. But that is something you did to keep yourself safe. And it was a really good idea because it worked. During or after the assault, call police if you can. And the advice is to leave the phone off the hook. And then once you're in a safe place, this safety plan says to have a friend or a family member take photographs of any injuries you sustained. If you're going to do that, be aware that if there is a trial, this friend or family member who took the photographs may be called to testify that they indeed did take those photographs, and here were the circumstances. So, some people may or may not be willing to do that. And also, if they're a key support of yours and you're both testifying, they may not be able to be in the courtroom to support you while you're testifying. So sometimes take those things into consideration when you're deciding who you're going to ask to photograph any injuries. And keep in mind, they're going to get worse. Bruises don't come up for a few days. If you choose to go to the hospital, and more hospitals, I think, are going to be having domestic assault teams similar to the sexual assault teams to respond to survivors of domestic violence. You can take photographs of damaged clothing and/or property to be used as evidence. And if you've been sexually assaulted and you choose to seek medical assistance, don't bathe or shower. Just go right to the hospital. Now, they used to say to get to the hospital within 72 hours. They're now saying that you probably have more like a week, like 5 days to a week. So this isn't complete. It's just an example from this template, the section that they have on during a violent incident, so you can get a sense of what it looks like. So that's one template. There's also this personalized safety plan. There's a link at the bottom, and there's also a link in the resources slides at the end. And this is another example of a safety plan that you can download, print out, give to clients, or work through with clients in your office. And of course, in many cases, you don't want that client putting that in her purse and going home with it, because the abuser may find it. So part of safety planning with a client is to decide, if you do a physical paper plan, where is that going to be kept? And how do you not have this discovered? So this is page 1 of the safety plan that you would that she may fill out with her name, the date, and this one is 9 pages as opposed to the other one, which is 29 pages. And it's got 4 steps. So I think it's got more than 4 steps, but this is the first 4 steps. Safety during a violent incident, which is very similar to that page we just looked at. Don't be in the kitchen where there's knives, be near a door. Safety when preparing to leave, because we know that's a time of increased risk if he becomes aware that you're planning to leave. Safety in my own residence after leaving the abuser, should he be coming around to your new place and trying to gain access and threatening you. Safety with a protection order, because as we know, as lovely as they are to have, they're just a piece of paper, and they don't necessarily keep you safe if he's bound and determined that he's going to find you. Safety at work and in public. Safety in drug and alcohol use. Safety in my emotional health, so there's a section on self-care, and then a handy-dandy checklist of items to take when leaving, and then there's some spaces to write in contact information for your community. This is a quote from another one of the resources at the end. To be effective, risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning strategies should be culturally informed and, where possible, culturally specific. And so there are culturally specific domestic violence risk assessment tools. And this slide lists several of them. There's some that are specific to honor-based violence. There's some for immigrant women. There's one that's a Chinese risk assessment tool. There's the Patriarch, which is a checklist of 15 risk and vulnerability factors for patriarchal violence. So there are specific tools available for specific cultural communities. And so we're wrapping up. I think we'll have some time for questions and answers, but I just want to quickly show you some of the resources that we included at the end. There is an online course in domestic violence safety planning available through MPSSG. And it's an 8 to 10 hour online training. It's free to anti-violence workers employed by an MPSSG funded program. There is the safety plan that we looked at. There is the other template that we looked at. A resource specifically for safety planning with children and youth, and all these links should be working. Or if not, you can just Google the titles and they will show up, or you can contact me at EVA BC. There's victim service providers training, and they have a section on child and youth safety planning videos. This is a good information bulletin for victim service workers, which is that protocol for highest risk domestic violence cases that Debbie mentioned earlier. And it sets out the roles and responsibilities of service providers across the justice and child welfare systems who respond to domestic violence. And Debbie, will you speak to the next few resources? There's CCWS.
Since they're laid out on the slides, you can take a look at them later. But in addition to these great resources, you can find there's a link there to the endingviolence.org website. There's also the building partnerships and step-by-step for creating a collaboration in your community for addressing violence against women issues, including risk identification and safety planning. So I won't go through every one because you can take a look at them yourselves. Many of you are probably familiar with the Interagency Case Assessment Team best practices, and there's many different resources here that you can access, including some great resources from the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative. It's something we look to for information frequently.
Thanks, Debbie. So we have some CCWS resources. We have You Are Not Alone. That's a toolkit specifically for Indigenous women. Advocacy Beyond Leaving. This is one I mentioned earlier, helping women in contact with current or former partners, and it's specifically for domestic violence advocates. There's an excellent free online training, Domestic Violence Risk Assessment and Management. And this is specifically for safety planning for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. And this resource is safety planning for persons with disabilities. And then there's a series of briefs from the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative, which we had a number of quotes from. And then I mentioned that the British Columbia Society of Transition Houses has done some really good work on technology safety planning, and this is a webinar that they did recently on technology safety planning with women and children, and this last resource slide is a technology safety plan. So we have some time for questions and answers.
So I think that sounds like the end of the presentation for today. So we just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this really important webinar. We also want to thank Debbie and Laura for the amazing presentation they did. I think they've covered a lot of content, in an amazingly short amount of time, and I think a very meaningful way. And I also want to thank Tiffany Fong, who's behind the scenes doing the technical support, which many of you haven't seen, but she's been an amazing help today as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we will be sending out the recording of this webinar in the next few weeks, as well as any of you have questions, you're welcome to get in touch with Laura or Debbie. And if you have difficulties accessing some of the resources, you also have my email from the online meeting request request that was sent out. So again, thanks so much for attending, and I hope you all have an amazing long weekend.